This story, my friends, begins in Harmony Creek, Iowa, a place where the corn grows taller than many people, and where the smell of wet earth is the official perfume. But Harmony Creek wasn't only famous for its corn, it was famous for the lands of Sterling Hawthorne. Sterling Hawthorne was a name that carried weight. He wasn't just a farmer, he was an empire. His lands stretched as far as the eye could see, and the money he made from the harvest, well, it could buy the whole town if he wanted. Sterling was a man of firm resolve, who trusted in numbers, in new tractors, and in the science of making the land produce. He had no time for superstitions, nor for idle chatter about what couldn't be touched. And it was precisely this man, practical and a millionaire, who began to be visited by a series of misfortunes that challenged everything he believed in. It all started slowly, in the spring, right after he bought that giant, imported combine harvester that cost the price of a mansion. He was so proud of that machine, so sure it was going to double production. The operator, a young man named Jed Miller, was working in the southern field, a good piece of land that always yielded a good harvest. It was 3 in the afternoon, the sun was high, and Jed was there in the air-conditioned cabin when he felt a jolt. It wasn't a jolt from a rock or a stump, it was a sharp jolt, as if the machine had struggled with the ground. Jed stopped, got out, and walked around. The combine harvester, which was supposed to be indestructible, was bent. It wasn't a flat tire. The front axle, a solid piece of steel, was bent like wire, and the engine, which had just been overhauled, was cracked in the block, a clean crack that looked like it had been made by an invisible axe. Jed turned white. He swore in front of Sterling that he hadn't hit anything. The field was clean. It was plowed land. "You must have fallen asleep, Jedediah," Sterling roared, having already called the supervisor. "This machine cost a fortune." "Mr. Hawthorne, I swear on my mother's life, I felt like something pulled the machine down, and then it shook all over. It wasn't my fault." Sterling didn't believe it. He was a man of logic. He sent Jed home, suspended him, and called in the city's best mechanics. They disassembled the machine on site. They searched for material failure, for defective parts. Nothing. The steel had broken with a force that no normal field operation could generate. They scratched their heads, and the final diagnosis was vague. Instantaneous metal fatigue under extreme stress. Sterling swallowed his frustration. It was a significant loss, but he could absorb it. It was an isolated accident, he thought. A new machine thing, perhaps a manufacturing defect that the engineers hadn't noticed. But it didn't stop there. 2 weeks later, misfortune struck again, and this time it was even more terrifying. Everything you've heard so far is just the beginning. The truth behind the events at Sterling Hawthorne's farm is far darker and more surprising than it seems, and the healer's intervention will reveal something no one was prepared to face. Before we move on, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support is what allows stories like this to continue reaching you. It was early morning, and one of the transport trucks loaded with fertilizer was parked near the large metal barn. The driver, Sam, had left the vehicle there around 10 o'clock at night and returned home. At 5 in the morning, when the first-hour team arrived, they found the truck. It was on its side. No, it wasn't overturned. It was flipped over, as if a child had pushed a toy aside. And the scene was impossible. The truck was on smooth asphalt, and there were no skid marks nor any sign that another vehicle had hit it. The strangest thing was the way it flipped over. The fuel tank, which was made of thick aluminum, was crushed against the ground, and the cabin, instead of being crushed by the impact, seemed to have been twisted before falling. The workers gathered, watching in silence. An 8-ton truck doesn't tip over on its own, on flat asphalt. No amount of wind could make it do that. Sterling Hawthorne arrived by helicopter, landing amidst the chaos. He saw the truck, smelled the leaking diesel, and his anger began to rise. "This is sabotage," he shouted, his gruff voice echoing across the field. "Someone is doing this on purpose." He immediately called the local sheriff, Jack Donovan. Jack was a good man but used to chicken theft and bar fights. He arrived with his 2 deputies, looking at the scene with a furrowed brow. "Sabotage, Mr. Hawthorne?" "But how? I don't know, Jack, but look at this. It's not natural." Sheriff Jack Donovan spent the entire morning investigating. He searched for crane tire tracks, explosives, anything that would indicate human interference. Nothing. The ground was clean, except for the tracks of the truck itself, which appeared to have been lifted and thrown. Donovan was a lawman. He needed concrete evidence. If someone did this, Mr. Hawthorne, they used equipment that leaves no trace. But why? Do you have enemies? Sterling Hawthorne was rich, and of course there were people who didn't like him, but no one he knew would have the audacity or the ability to carry out such clean and effective acts of destruction. The sheriff withdrew, promising more frequent patrols, but the truth is he had no way of documenting it. The report remained vague. Accident of undetermined cause, possibly structural failure combined with atypical strong winds. Unusually strong wind in a parked truck. Sterling laughed nervously. From that day on, fear settled over Hawthorne Farms. The workers, who had once been cheerful and boisterous, began to walk with their heads down. They whispered about the evil eye, about cursed land. Sterling tried to maintain order. He doubled salaries, offered bonuses, but fear was stronger than money, and the accidents continued, as if the farm were being attacked by an invisible and relentless enemy. One day it was the irrigation system. A line of PVC pipes buried a meter deep simply burst, not in one spot, but in 20 different places, in a straight line, as if something had passed underneath and punctured everything at once. The damage was the loss of an entire soybean field. The next day, a new small tractor, which was being used to pull light implements, caught fire. The fire started in the engine, but when the firefighters arrived, the engine was intact. The fire was burning the seat, the steering wheel, and the tires, but the fuel and the engine, the hottest part, were cold. The firefighters were paralyzed. "Fire makes no sense, sir." "Hawthorne," said the fire chief, a man named Pete who had seen it all. "There's no ignition point. It looks like the material decided to burn." Sterling was losing sleep. He was a man who controlled everything, but now control had slipped through his fingers. He had already lost more than $500,000 in equipment, and the insurance company was starting to ask difficult questions. The insurance company, a Chicago giant, sent its own investigators. Men in suits, with clipboards and sophisticated cameras. They spent days on the farm. They examined the land, tested the quality of the steel, checked the maintenance records. They were the best at finding fraud or negligence. They looked for electrical faults, for internal sabotage by a disgruntled employee, for anything that could provide a cold, hard reason for the chaos. They found nothing. Their report was even more frustrating for Sterling. The chief adjuster, a fellow called Mr. Thompson, was a skeptical man. "Mr. Hawthorne, we have no way of closing these cases. There's no definite cause. There's no evidence of a crime. There's no foreseeable mechanical failure. It's as if the farm is under attack by a force of nature that only attacks its property." Before leaving, Thompson left a cold suggestion. "I suggest you start looking for the human element, someone who has access to your land and is using methods we can't trace, or if it's something more." Thompson hesitated, gazing at the vast expanse of land. "Perhaps it's time to call in someone who can handle what's not in the engineering textbooks." Sterling Hawthorne, the man who laughed at astrology and alternative therapies, stood in the light rain. Calling someone who dealt with what's not in the engineering textbooks? He thought the idea ridiculous. He was a man of science and money. But despair was knocking at the door. The last straw came the following week. It wasn't a machine. It was an employee. A man named Billy, a quiet guy who looked after the grain silos, was doing a routine inspection. The silos were giant, secure, and well-built metal structures. Billy was on top of silo number 4, strapped in with a safety harness, checking the moisture sensors. Suddenly, the other workers heard a sharp scream, followed by a metallic bang. When they ran to look, Billy was hanging by his belt, but what happened to the silo was what made everyone vomit with fear. Silo number 4, filled with corn to the brim, had a deformity on its side. It wasn't a dent. It was a round, perfect hole about 2 meters in diameter, 10 meters from the ground. Corn gushed out of the hole, and Billy, who was on top, had his face covered in blood. He hadn't fallen. The structure had opened up beside him, and worse, the steel around the hole was bent inward, as if something inside the silo had exploded, but without the explosion, or as if a giant hand had squeezed the metal from the outside in, tearing it apart. Billy was rushed to the hospital. He was in shock, When he finally managed to speak, he could only repeat one thing. The silo groaned. It groaned. And I looked. And the metal was bending. It wasn't fast. It was slow. It was warning me. The doctor said Billy had suffered a severe head injury, but what Sterling saw at the hospital was pure terror in the man's eyes. The workers at Hawthorne Farms began to resign en masse. They no longer wanted the money. They wanted security. They said the land was in revolt, that there was something rotten and old that Sterling had disturbed. Sterling Hawthorne found himself alone in the midst of his crumbling empire. The machines were stopped, the fields unplanted, the silos empty. He had called the police, the engineers, the fire brigade, and all had failed. They could not fight against the invisible, against the illogical. He sat in his mahogany office, overlooking the now silent fields, holding the insurance company's final report, which denied coverage due to absence of a definite physical cause. That's when he remembered the skeptical adjuster's suggestion, to call someone who could deal with what wasn't in the books. There was a person in the region, more than 100 miles from Harmony Creek, whom the old guard always mentioned in whispers. A woman who lived in the mountains near Blackwood, known for being a healer, a reader of signs, someone who worked with the energy of the earth. Sterling Hawthorne felt a shudder of shame at the mere thought of seeking her out. He, the man of science and progress, searching for a witch. But the silence on the farm was louder than his pride. Bankruptcy was looming, and the fear was palpable. If he didn't do something drastic, he would lose everything. He made a single call, using a number he had obtained from an old retired farmer who had cured his cattle of a mysterious disease years before. On the other end of the line, a hoarse, calm voice answered, "Try? My name is Sterling Hawthorne. I am the farmer of Harmony Creek. I have a problem that nobody can solve. Machines break down, things turn on their own. I need help." There was a long silence on the line, and Sterling almost hung up, thinking he was being ridiculous. "Hawthorne Farms," the voice said. "I know who you are, and I know your problem." Sterling straightened up in his chair. "How do you know?" "The earth speaks, Mr. Hawthorne, and your earth is screaming." The woman's name was Ilara Vance. She didn't use a cell phone, only an old landline, and lived a simple life. She didn't care about money, but she did care about balance. "My price isn't in money, Mr. Hawthorne," Ilara said. "It's in honesty. I'll go all the way to Harmony Creek. But you have to promise me one thing. You'll do exactly what I say without question, even if it seems crazy." Sterling Hawthorne, the most powerful and skeptical man in the county, swallowed his pride. "I promise, Ilara. Come as soon as possible." And so, the stage was set. The world of logic and engineering had completely failed. Now, Sterling Hawthorne's only hope lay in the hands of a woman who could converse with the earth. Ilara arrived 2 days later, hitching a ride in an old pickup truck, and her presence at Hawthorne Farms was like the arrival of an unexpected storm. She was small, with braided white hair, and wore simple, dark clothes. She had piercing eyes, the color of damp earth. Sterling received her with his characteristic formality, trying to hide his discomfort. "Ilara, thank you for coming. I'll show you the damage." He took her to the punctured silo first. The investigators were still there, collecting metal samples. Ilara didn't look at the hole. She knelt on the hard-packed earth, closed her eyes, and placed her hand on the ground. She stayed like that for a long minute. The engineers looked at her condescendingly, but Sterling silenced them with a glance. When Ilara stood up, she looked tired, but her voice was firm. "It's not human sabotage, Mr. Hawthorne. And it's not a ghost. It's something older and hungrier." "Hungry?" Sterling felt a shiver run through him. "Yes, the earth is in pain, and that pain is manifesting in your machines because they are an extension of your will to dominate. What is happening here is a reaction." Sterling, accustomed to technical reports, tried to rationalize. A reaction to what? Pesticides? Soil change? Ilara shook her head impatiently. No, a reaction to injustice. She walked around the farm without needing a map, as if she knew every inch of the land. She visited the spot where the combine harvester had broken down and where the truck had overturned. At each place, she repeated the same ritual. She knelt, touched the earth, and murmured words in a language Sterling had never heard. The remaining workers watched from a distance. They were more afraid of Ilara than of the accidents. They understood that she was stirring up forces they preferred to ignore. At the end of the day, Ilara was back in Sterling's office. The farmer was exhausted and ready for any answer, no matter how absurd. "What do we have to do, Ilara? Did you find the cause?" Ilara placed her hands on Sterling's mahogany desk and stared at him. "The cause is you, Mr. Hawthorne, and what you did 10 years ago." Sterling turned pale. "What did I do 10 years ago? I bought more land, I innovated, You bought a specific field, the stream field, which was known locally as the resting land, a sacred place where the ancients buried their most precious belongings. You bought it, and to drain the swamp and plant soybeans, you had it excavated." "That was just a silly legend," protested Sterling. "It was just a useless swamp." "It was a sanctuary, and when you dug it up and threw away what was there, you not only disturbed the rest, but you stole what maintained the balance of that area." Ilara leaned over the table. "What's attacking your machines isn't a spirit, Mr. Hawthorne. It's the memory of the earth, and it wants to be repaired. It wants what is hers back." The challenge now was immense. Sterling had to accept that his ruin was not caused by mechanical failure, but by an ancient offense against the sacred, and he had to discover exactly what he had thrown away 10 years before and how to bring it back. The healer was forcing him to look back at a mistake he didn't even consider a mistake. "What did I throw away?" Sterling asked, his voice trembling. "It was an object of power, an object that was buried to protect the harvest. You have to find it, Mr. Hawthorne, and return it to the soil. Otherwise, the accidents won't stop. They'll become more personal, closer to you." Sterling felt the weight of the threat. He had to sift through 10 years of construction, earthworks, and debris to find an object he didn't even know what it was, all to appease an angry land. Rational investigation had failed. Now, the search for the inexplicable began. Ilara Vance was ready to begin the work of healing the farm, and the first step, she insisted, was a simple but crucial ceremony. "Let's start with an acknowledgement, Mr. Hawthorne. You have to apologize, out loud, and then we'll look for what you took from there." Sterling, though reluctant, agreed. He was broken, and Ilara's word was his only compass. The first part of the mystery was solved. It wasn't sabotage, but revenge. Now came the reparation. That same night, under the dim moonlight, Ilara guided Sterling to the stream field, the site of the excavation 10 years ago. She carried an earthen bowl filled with water and dried herbs. "Stay here, Mr. Hawthorne, and tell me how you feel." Sterling, the businessman, the millionaire, felt ridiculous standing in the dark field, but he looked at the ground and saw in his mind the image of the crooked combine harvester and the torn silo. I'm so sorry," he murmured, his voice faltering. "I didn't know, I didn't respect that." Ilara turned to him, her eyes gleaming in the darkness. "That's not enough. Be honest with the land. Tell it what you took from it. Rest, dignity." Sterling took a deep breath. "I ask forgiveness for having desecrated this place, for having taken what was not mine, and for having prioritized greed over history. I recognize that the earth has memory, and I want to restore the balance." Ilara smiled, a small but powerful smile. She poured the water with the herbs onto the ground and began to hum. "The first step has been taken," she said. "Now, the search. What you took from here, Mr. Hawthorne, wasn't thrown in the regular trash. Think about it. Where did you dispose of the material that came out of the excavation 10 years ago?" Sterling began searching his memory, rummaging through old receipts and contracts, trying to find a trace of the object that would save his life and his farm. He needed to discover the fate of that sacred soil that had been removed before the next fatal accident. The silence in Sterling Hawthorne's mahogany office was heavier than the weight of the gold he had lost. Ilara Vance sat serenely in the leather armchair while Sterling rummaged through stacks of old papers, his fingers trembling slightly. He was searching for a ghost in the form of a receipt. "The stream field, the excavation from 10 years ago," Sterling murmured to himself, trying to recall the details he had worked so hard to forget. "I remember the material was problematic. It was very clayey, with a lot of peat. It couldn't be mixed with the good soil. Exactly, Ilara said, without even looking at the papers. Her eyes were half closed, as if she were reading the history of the farm in the fibers of the Persian rug. You didn't want the bad soil to contaminate the rest. You wanted to bury the evidence that that piece of land ever existed. Sterling swallowed hard. The woman could read his thoughts, or perhaps she could read the truth he was trying to hide even from himself. I hired a hauling company. I paid them double to take the material far away, out of the county, for proper disposal. I didn't want that trash in my fields. He finally found the folder, yellowed, with the company name handwritten on it. Gravel and Haul Services. Here it is. The disposal contract. Ilara leaned forward. Don't look at the price, Sir Hawthorne. Look at the destination. Where did the sacred land go? Sterling ran his finger along the blurred line on the paper. Blackstone Quarry. They were using fill dirt to level an area for a new industrial park, about 50 miles from here. The contract stated that the material would be used as a base, buried under concrete. A heavy sigh escaped Sterling. The material wasn't in an easy-to-search landfill. It was beneath a mountain of other debris and about to be covered by a cement foundation. It's a huge area, Ilara. Thousands of tons of rubble. How are we going to find an object, whatever it is, in the middle of all that? Ilara closed her eyes again. The object of power, Mr. Hawthorne, is not just a piece of metal or wood, it is a beacon. It vibrates. When you removed it from the resting land, the vibration was interrupted and the land became disoriented. But it is still there, emitting a faint signal. What am I looking for? Sterling asked desperately. Something small. Something that looks like a disc or a medallion. Old. It wasn't made by their machines. It was made by the hands of someone who respected the cycle. It should be wrapped in something organic, perhaps fabric or old leather. Sterling felt a profound weariness. He had to go after a medallion buried 50 miles away, in a giant construction site. We need to go now, he said, standing up. Wait, Ilara raised her hand. The Earth knows we're acting and it doesn't like haste. Sterling didn't have time to ask what she meant. At that exact moment, a dry, sharp noise came from the living room downstairs. It wasn't a bang, but a sound of glass shattering violently, followed by a metallic groan. Sterling and Ilara ran down the stairs. The living room was a sanctuary of luxury, and at its center was Sterling's pendulum clock, a family heirloom made of solid oak, which kept time with Swiss precision. The clock was intact, but the heavy glass case that protected the pendulum, a piece that must have been at least a centimeter thick, was in pieces on the floor. And not only that. The brass pendulum, which had been swinging rhythmically for over 100 years, was bent, not sideways, but twisted in the middle, as if someone had grabbed both ends and spun it with superhuman strength. Sterling was paralyzed. It was his time, his order, that was being attacked. My house, he whispered. Ilara approached the shards of glass, looking at the twisted pendulum. I warned you, Mr. Hawthorne. Accidents would become more personal. This is a warning. The force at work here doesn't just want your machines, it wants to dismantle your control. Its time is different from yours, and it's impatient. The fear, which had previously been a financial concern, was now visceral. The farm was attacking the farmer, entering his home, desecrating his most intimate belongings. What do we do? Sterling asked. We're going to Blackstone Quarry, and we're going to pray that the concrete hasn't been poured yet. The drive to Blackstone Quarry was long and silent. Sterling drove his luxury van, accustomed to calling his drivers or traveling first class. Now he was beside a woman who seemed to have stepped out of another century, guided by a stained paper map and his intuition. Ilara didn't talk much, but when she did, it was to give strange instructions. Drive slowly when we get close to the town of Blackwood, and don't touch the radio. Sterling obeyed. He had no more arguments. The sight of his family clock destroyed had shattered the last vestiges of his skepticism. When they arrived at the landfill site, the scene was desolate. Blackstone Quarry was a vast scar on the landscape. The new industrial park was being built on what had once been a huge hole in the ground. There were mounds of earth and rubble everywhere, giant tractors standing idle, and piles of steel rebar. The smell was of fresh earth mixed with diesel oil and cement dust. Sterling stopped the car near the main gate. "It's here," he said, pointing to a mound of dark earth that looked like it had been recently dumped. "The material from the stream field must be mixed into this mound, or perhaps it was already spread out as a base." He got out of the car, feeling small in the face of the scale of the operation. "Ilara, that's impossible. Where do we even begin digging?" Ilara also descended. She didn't look at the top of the mountain, but at the base at how the ground met the earth. "Let's go for a walk, Mr. Hawthorne. I need to feel my pulse." They walked for about half an hour, dodging puddles of mud and loose stones. Sterling, in his leather boots and button-down shirt, felt like an outsider. Ilara, however, seemed at home. She touched the ground with her fingertips as if she were reading Braille. Finally, she stopped at a point that looked identical to any other. It was a gentle slope where the dark earth of the landfill met the native red clay of the quarry. "Here," she said simply. "Here? But this is the middle of nowhere. It doesn't look any different from anywhere else." "The object isn't on the surface, Mr. Hawthorne, but its trail is. The energy it emanates, however weak, is being pulled back to its origin, to Harmony Creek, and that's where the trail is strongest." Ilara knelt down and took a small copper bell and a handful of dried seeds from her cloth bag. The object was buried to honor the harvest, to ensure abundance. It was the Guardian. "To find it, we need to send a message of reverence." She began a silent ritual. She scattered the seeds on the ground in a perfect circle and rang the bell 3 times. The sound was surprisingly clear and pure amidst the industrial desolation. "Now, you're going to help me mark out the area. Do you have any digging tools in your vehicle?" Sterling returned to the truck and retrieved the only equipment he had, an emergency folding shovel, which he kept for getting things unstuck. It was ridiculous to think of using it to dig up a mountain of earth. "That's all we have." "That's enough for now. You'll dig where I tell you to. I'll use the residual energy to map the location. The object isn't very deep at this point. It was thrown here and buried, but it wasn't mixed with the rest of the rubble." Ilara then did something Sterling would never forget. She put her hands together, closed her eyes, and began to breathe deeply. Her posture changed. She seemed to be sinking into the earth. After a few minutes, she opened her eyes. They were brighter, almost golden, and she spoke with an authority that belied her small stature. "The disc is strong. It's about 3 meters deep, and it's wrapped in a hemp fabric which is almost disintegrated. 3 meters with a shovel?" Sterling was almost laughing in despair. "Ilara, it'll take us weeks, and construction starts tomorrow. So we have to be quick. You have to find someone who has digging equipment, someone you can trust." Sterling thought of his former foreman, but they had all fled in fear. He thought of Sheriff Donovan, but he couldn't involve him in this. He remembered Jed Miller, the combine harvester operator he had unjustly suspended. Jed was a loyal man of the land, and he had access to heavy equipment through a cousin who worked in earth moving. "I know a man. Jed Miller. I treated him badly, but he can help me. Call him, tell him the truth. Honesty is the only currency that works here." Sterling made the call, feeling humiliated. He explained to Jed that he was in Blackstone Quarry, looking for something he had desecrated 10 years earlier, and that he urgently needed an excavator. Jed, to Sterling's surprise, did not laugh. He had seen the accidents. He had felt the fear. "I'll call my cousin, Mr. Hawthorne. He can bring a small backhoe, but it'll be expensive. Pay whatever it takes, Jed. I'm paying with my soul." Jed promised to arrive in 3 hours, bringing his cousin and the equipment. While they waited, Ilara used the time to refocus. She asked Sterling to walk around the spot she had marked and to repeat aloud the promise of reparation he had made to the land. "The earth needs to hear your heart, Mr. Hawthorne, not just your voice." Sterling walked, feeling the weight of guilt. He spoke of his greed, of how the desire for more land and more corn blinded him to what was truly important, respect for what was ancient. As he spoke, Ilara began tracing lines on the ground with a stick. She was creating an energy map. "The disc is here," she said, pointing to the center of the seed circle. "But there's something more." "What else?" "There is a second object, smaller, more fragile. It was attached to the disc, but the force of the excavation displaced it. It is closer to the surface, less than a meter away. Then let's dig through that one first, exclaimed Sterling, grabbing the folding shovel. No, Ilara interrupted. The disc is what has the power to stop the vengeance. The other object is the key to understanding why it was buried. If you try to remove the smaller object now, without the disc's power to calm the earth, the vengeance could turn against us. Sterling stepped back. He trusted Ilara completely now. 3 hours later, the sound of a heavy diesel engine tore through the silence of the quarry. Jed Miller arrived in an old pickup truck, followed by a medium-sized backhoe driven by his cousin, a large, quiet man named Roy. Jed climbed down and faced Sterling, the millionaire farmer who was now scratching the ground with a toy shovel. "What are we looking for, Mr. Hawthorne?" "An object. A metal disc, buried 3 meters deep, somewhere within that circle of seeds." Jed and Roy exchanged glances. They didn't question it. The fear that hung over Hawthorne Farms was enough to convince anyone to dig in search of a magic disc. 3 meters, Mr. Hawthorne, that's a serious hole, said Roy, scratching his head. "I'll have to dig carefully." Ilara approached the machine. "Roy, you're going to dig slowly. You're going to feel the earth. When the excavator's bucket touches something different, something that isn't rock or clay, you stop." Roy, accustomed to technical orders, simply nodded. There was something in Ilara's voice that demanded obedience. The work began. The sound of the backhoe's bucket biting into the earth was deafening. Piles of dark earth began to grow beside the hole. Sterling and Jed watched, tense. The sun was setting, tinging the sky orange and purple, and the pressure of time was overwhelming. If the object wasn't found before dawn, and if construction work began, they could lose it forever. With each meter, the shell descended, the tension increased. 1 meter. The ground was cold and compacted. 2 meters. Roy was working with incredible precision, as if he were transplanting a flower, not digging an embankment. When the shell reached the nearly 3-meter mark, there was a different sound. Not the sound of stone against metal, but a dry scraping. Roy stopped the engine immediately. Silence returned, broken only by the men's heavy breathing. "I touched something," Roy said, climbing down from the cabin. "It's not a rock, it's light." Ilara ran to the edge of the hole. "Don't use the ladle again. You go down, Roy. Use the shovel and your hands." Roy was too big to easily slide down into the narrow hole, but he did, supported by Jed. He began to remove the earth around the point of contact. Sterling was on the brink of collapse, his heart racing. He was 1 step away from confirming the madness that had engulfed his life. Roy cleared the earth and shouted, "There's something here, it's round." With extreme care, Roy pulled out the object. It was small, about the size of the palm of his hand, and wrapped in a dark brown, almost black fabric that crumbled at the touch. Roy went upstairs, breathless, and placed the find in Ilara's hands. Ilara held it reverently. She removed the old cloth and revealed the disc. It was made of a dark metal, perhaps bronze or very old copper, and was inlaid with symbols that Sterling couldn't decipher. It wasn't polished. It was rough, heavy, and when Ilara held it, Sterling swore he felt a heat radiate from the object. "The Guardian," Ilara whispered. "He's back." She looked at Sterling, and her golden eyes were full of triumph. "You found him, Mr. Hawthorne. The first step in the reparation is complete. Now the vengeance will cease." But Sterling wasn't looking at the disc. He was looking at the hole. "Ilara, you said there was a second object. What is it?" Ilara nodded, holding the disc firmly. "Yes, the smaller object, the key to the story. It must be nearby in the dirt Roy just dug up." Jed and Roy began to sift through the pile of earth that had been removed. It was a meticulous search, sifting through the dark soil with their hands. The sun had already completely disappeared, and the darkness in the quarry was almost total. Sterling turned on the truck's headlights to illuminate the area. It was Jed who shouted, "I thought." He was holding something that looked like a piece of bone or old wood. It was small and fragile, and Jed carefully placed it on a piece of clean canvas. Ilara knelt down and examined the second object. It was a fragment of polished bone, engraved with a single line of symbols. "This is the record," Ilara explained in a low voice. The record was the protection. This object tells the story. She touched the bone and closed her eyes. Her breathing became shallow, and the expression on her face turned to deep sadness. Sterling, Jed, and Roy watched in complete silence. When Ilara opened her eyes, she was crying. Silent tears streamed down her face. The land of Harmony Creek. It wasn't just guarding a treasure. It was guarding a terrible memory. "What is it, Ilara?" Sterling asked. "The bone tells the story of a family that lived in that creek field long ago, even before Harmony Creek existed. A family of settlers who were accused of witchcraft and driven from their land. They were the original guardians." "Expelled?" "No, they were massacred, and the record was buried there with them, so that the earth would protect their souls and their memory. When you dug, Mr. Hawthorne, you didn't just take an object. You took the grave of a wronged family and threw it away like garbage." The shock hit Sterling with the force of a punch. He wasn't just a greedy farmer. He was a grave robber. The land's revenge wasn't about corn. It was about blood and memory. "What happened to them?" asked Sterling, feeling nauseous. "They were accused of causing the harvest to fail, of cursing the cattle. And what happened to their machines, Mr. Hawthorne, is a reflection of what happened to them. The land is returning the terror you caused." The mission had changed. It was no longer just about finding an object, but about restoring the dignity of a lost family. "What do we do now, Ilara? The record is here. Will the accidents ever stop?" Ilara was holding the disc and the bone. "The attack will cease, but the cure is not complete. You must return the record to where it was taken from, and you must return it with honor, Mr. Hawthorne. And the family needs a memorial." She stood up, her small yet powerful figure under the light of the headlights. "Let's go back to Harmony Creek. You're going to need help building a sanctuary, and you're going to have to face the truth about your land." Jed and Roy looked at Sterling with a mixture of compassion and horror. They had witnessed a secret that went far beyond agriculture. Sterling Hawthorne, the man of money and logic, gazed at the small, dark metal disc in search of salvation. He knew that the task of repair would be more difficult than the search. He had to reconstruct history, and not just his farm. He had to tell the truth about what lay beneath his vast cornfields. He picked up the disc and the bone, feeling the weight of history in his hands. "Let's go home," he said, his voice hoarse. "We have a grave to build." The return trip was quicker. The fear was still there, but now there was a purpose. The invisible had a name: Revenge of Memory. And Ilara Vance had the map to peace. Upon arriving at the farm, the first thing Sterling noticed was the silence. The idle machines seemed like just machines, not sleeping monsters. The fear of the previous days had dissipated, replaced by a tense calm. Ilara confirmed, "The Guardian is back in your possession. The attack is suspended, but it won't last if we don't return it to the ground." The next phase demanded courage and faith. Sterling had to expose his crime and his secret to the community, and he had to perform an act of reverence that would challenge his entire reputation. He had to honor the dead whom he had disrespected. Ilara guided him to the stream field. "We're not going to bury the record now, we're going to prepare it, and we're going to prepare the site. You need witnesses to this act, Mr. Hawthorne. You need the community to see that you are bowing to the truth." "Witnesses?" Sterling hesitated. "I don't want the city to know about this. I'll be ridiculed." "You're already on the verge of ruin and ridicule," Ilara said bluntly. "The only thing left is your honor. Call Jed. Call Sheriff Donovan. Call whoever you suspended, whoever you suspected. They need to see the reparations." Sterling spent the rest of the night making phone calls. He called Sheriff Jack Donovan, saying he had discovered the true cause of the accidents and needed him as a witness to a restoration act. He called Jed Miller, asking him to bring Roy and his family. At dawn, a small group of people gathered at the creek field. Sheriff Donovan was visibly uncomfortable but curious. Jed stood beside Sterling with a look of respect. Ilara was in the center, with the disc and the bone in her hands. "This place," Ilara began, her calm voice carrying over the damp field, "will no longer be a cornfield. It will be a sanctuary." She instructed Sterling to dig a small pit, not deep, but wide. "The disc will return to Earth, Mr. Hawthorne. But the bone, the memory, needs to be preserved. Sterling dug, feeling the damp earth in his hands. Ilara then began to speak about the massacred family, using the information she had read on the bone. She didn't use names, but spoke of the pain of injustice and the fury of the earth. When the disc is returned, the earth will calm down, but the balance will only be maintained if their story is remembered here. She handed the record to Sterling. Put him in the hole and ask for forgiveness one last time. Sterling, in front of his employees and the sheriff, knelt down and placed the disc on the ground. I return what I took, he said, his voice choked with emotion. May peace return to this land, and may the memory of those who rest here be honored. He covered the disc with earth. Ilara picked up the engraved bone. Now, the memorial. What Sterling would do next would be the ultimate test of his acceptance. He had to build something that would last, something that would symbolize that the value of that land was greater than the value of the harvest. The healing of the farm depended on an act of permanent humility. He had to transform resting land into a monument, and Ilara had the plan. The healing of the farm depended on an act of permanent humility. He had to transform the resting land into a monument, and Ilara had the plan. Ilara, holding the engraved bone and the bronze disc, looked at Sterling and the few men gathered at the creek field. The record is back home, Mr. Hawthorne, but it's only a protective shield. The soul of this land, its memory, needs a place of honor that will last longer than corn and concrete. Sterling, still kneeling on the damp ground, raised his head. What should I build, Ilara? A simple memorial, made of stone that isn't from here. We can't take anything more from this soil. You'll bring stones from afar, Mr. Hawthorne, stones that symbolize eternity and permanence. And you'll build a small mound, a cairn, on the exact spot where the excavation desecrated the resting place. Sheriff Donovan cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. A monument, Sterling. You're going to turn farmland into a historical site. Yes, Jack, Sterling replied, with a firmness that surprised the sheriff. I will. This field will never be planted again. It will be fenced off and protected. It will truly be the land of rest. This was the ultimate test of his acceptance. It wasn't enough to bury an object. He had to sacrifice a piece of his empire to honor what he had stolen. Sterling immediately put Jed Miller in charge. Jed, I want you to call the granite quarry in Blackwood. I want the hardest, darkest stones. I don't care about the cost. You'll oversee the construction. Jed, the man Sterling had accused of negligence, now held the most important responsibility on the farm. Jed nodded, his eyes welling with tears. He understood that Sterling was apologizing in a way that money could never repay. I will do it, Mr. Hawthorne. The following days were filled with feverish work, but unlike anything Hawthorne Farms had ever seen, there was no rush to harvest, but rather a sense of reverence. Roy's backhoe was brought back, not to dig, but to move the heavy granite boulders that arrived in trucks. Sterling worked alongside Jed and Roy. He carried stones, cleared the site, and for the first time in years, felt a physical connection to the earth, not as a resource to be exploited, but as a body to be cared for. Sheriff Donovan, at first, remained skeptical. He stopped by the site a few times, watching Sterling, the millionaire, sweaty and covered in dust, building a mound of stones in honor of a story he could hardly believe. Is this for the insurance report, Sterling? Donovan asked during one of his visits. Sterling paused, wiping his forehead. No, Jack, this is for my life report. I understood that what was attacking me wasn't bad luck, but my memory, and the only way to stop it is to restore my dignity. Donovan shook his head, not understanding but respecting Sterling's newfound silence. While the foundations for the memorial were being prepared, Ilara Vance was busy with the engraved bone. She explained that the fragile object, the record of the injustice, needed to be protected so that the memory would not fade. The earth calmed down with the return of the disc, she told Sterling, but if we lose history, the fury could return. Ilara spent an entire day polishing the bone, and then asked Sterling to provide a small, handmade, airtight copper box. Copper is a conductive metal. It will ensure that the memory remains alive and that the earth can access it, but without destroying it. Sterling obtained the copper box from a local craftsman. He watched as Ilara carefully placed the bone inside, sealing the lid with beeswax. It was a simple reliquary, but laden with meaning. A week later, the memorial was ready. It wasn't imposing, but it was solid, a mound of dark granite with a flat slab on top. The stream field, now surrounded by a rustic wooden fence, seemed like a place of peace. The day of the final ceremony has arrived. It was late afternoon, and the sky was clear. Besides Sterling, Jed, Roy, and Sheriff Donovan, some workers who had returned to the farm were present. They kept their distance, but watched respectfully. Ilara was dressed in black, and she was carrying the small copper box. "What shall we do now, Ilara?" Sterling asked. "You will take the final oath, Mr. Hawthorne. You will promise the land that this story will be remembered, and that this place will be sacred. Then, the memory will be sealed." Sterling approached the granite slab. He had prepared some words, but when he looked at the sky and the earth he had almost destroyed, the prepared words vanished. "I, Sterling Hawthorne," his voice was strong but broken with emotion, "solemnly promise that this resting land will be preserved. I promise that the errors of the past, the disrespect and the greed will not be repeated. I acknowledge the memory of this land and the pain of the injustice that I helped to perpetuate. May this memorial be proof that honor and respect are more valuable than all the harvest in the world." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I ask that the fury cease and that peace return to Hawthorne Farms." Ilara approached and placed the copper box in the center of the slab. She used a special mortar made with clay from Campo do Riacho itself and water from a clean stream to fix the reliquary to the granite. As the mortar dried, she began to sing. It wasn't a sad song, but a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from beneath the earth. It was a song of liberation. When the song ended, Ilara placed her hand on the sealed copper box. "It is done. The memory is protected. The guardian is home. The land of Harmony Creek is healed." At that moment, everyone felt it. It wasn't a dramatic event, but a subtle change, as if an invisible pressure had been released. The air seemed lighter, the smell of earth purer. Sheriff Donovan, who had been standing with his arms crossed, suddenly relaxed his shoulders. I don't know what I saw, Sterling, but I feel the air is clear." Jed Miller smiled, a genuine smile that Sterling hadn't seen in months. "The farm is at peace, Mr. Hawthorne. I can feel it." From that day forward, peace returned to Hawthorne Farms. The idle machines were back in operation without problems. The tractors, which had previously seemed to have a life of their own, were operating with the expected precision. The punctured silo was repaired, and the structure remained firm. The workers who had fled began calling, asking if they could return. They had heard about the memorial and the move to Sterling. Sterling Hawthorne was a transformed man. He was no longer the skeptical and impetuous farmer. He was quieter, more reflective. He had learned that the world was not governed solely by numbers and engineering. When the farm was fully operational again, Ilara Vance prepared to leave. Sterling drove her back in his pickup truck, offering her a thick envelope of money. "Ilara, I know you said your price wasn't money, but please, you saved my life and my legacy." Ilara pushed the envelope back toward him. "The money is yours, Mr. Hawthorne. I received what I needed, honesty and reparation. Balance has been restored." They stopped by the side of the road a few miles from Blackwood. "Before I go, Ilara, I need to understand something. Why were the accidents so specific? Why the crooked combine harvester, the overturned truck, the broken pendulum? Why not a regular fire?" Ilara Vance gazed at the horizon, where the land of Harmony Creek met the sky. "The earth has a memory, Mr. Hawthorne, and memory is a mirror. What you experienced was a repetition of the original trauma." She explained that the family that had been massacred was not only accused of witchcraft, they were farmers trying to innovate, using irrigation and planting methods that the ignorant community of the time considered black magic. What did they do to the father of the family? They accused him of breaking the neighbor's harvesting tools with witchcraft, and the way they killed him was with a blow that broke his bones and left him twisted like the shaft of his combine harvester. Sterling shuddered. The truck overturned. The family's house was knocked down on its side, not burned but overturned, as a sign that they no longer had a place on the ground. Their truck, their symbol of transportation and wealth, was mirrored. And the silo? The hole in the silo? Ilara sighed. The mother of the family, in despair, tried to hide with her youngest son inside the barn. The attackers pierced the barn with spears and pitchforks from the outside in to force them out. The silo groaned and opened, Mr. Hawthorne, because it was a repetition of that terror. Sterling felt a chill down his spine. He hadn't suffered accidents. He had suffered a historical curse, a flashback of violence that the land held. And what about my pendulum clock? The clock, Mr. Hawthorne, represented your order, your control over time. They didn't just want to destroy your property, they wanted to break your time. The family was killed because the community couldn't wait for the natural cycle of the harvest. They were impatient, and they destroyed the order. The land was breaking your order, saying that the time for vengeance had come. Sterling stood silently, absorbing the depth of the tragedy. You saved me, Ilara. I just listened, Mr. Hawthorne. The earth always tells the truth. You just needed to stop listening to the noise of your machines and start listening to the whisper of the soil. Ilara got out of the truck. She didn't look back. She started walking down the dusty road, quickly disappearing in the direction of Blackwood. Sterling Hawthorne returned to Harmony Creek. He was no longer the same. He had learned that being a true farmer wasn't about how much you could take from the land, but how much you were willing to give back to it. The creek field, with its granite memorial, became a landmark. People came from other towns to see the monument, and Sterling recounted the story, not as a legend but as a historical fact. He never planted soybeans in that field again, transforming it into a native pasture, full of wildflowers and tall grass. Hawthorne Farms prospered again, but with a new philosophy. Jed Miller was promoted to general supervisor, and he was the one who made the decisions about planting and harvesting, always with Sterling's advice. And curiously, the inexplicable accidents never returned. The land was at peace because justice, even if belated, had been done. The secret of Sterling Hawthorne's success was no longer in his new tractors or his fertilizers, but in a small bronze disc buried beneath the soil, and a granite memorial that reminded everyone that history and memory have more power than any machine. The skeptical millionaire became the guardian of silenced stories, and that, my friends, was the most valuable harvest of all. Sterling Hawthorne returned to Harmony Creek with his head full of stories that he, the man of numbers, never imagined he would tell. The luxury van seemed strange and empty without Ilara Vance beside him, but the silence that had once been one of fear was now one of respect. He had bought an empire, but inherited a responsibility. The first thing Sterling did, as soon as he arrived at the farm, was to go to the creek field. He didn't go to inspect, but to stand silently near the granite memorial. The small mound of dark stones, sealing the bronze disc and the memory of a family, was the center of his universe now. Peace was not an explosive event, it was a slow and steady relief, like water flowing clean again after a flood. The next morning, Jed Miller, now general supervisor, arrived early. He didn't go straight to Sterling's office, but stopped at the memorial. Sterling found him there, dusting the stones. "Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne," said Jed, without taking his eyes off the granite. "Good morning, Jed. What do we have planned for today?" "The new combine harvester, the one Jedediah Miller broke," Jed smiled, a sad smile. "The mechanic said it's ready. We're going to test it in the west field." Sterling felt a chill. The combine harvester was the symbol of the beginning of misfortune. Do it. And Jed, if you feel anything strange, any jolt, stop the machine immediately. Jed shook his head. "I won't feel a thing, Mr. Hawthorne. The earth isn't pulling anymore." And Jed was right. He spent the entire day in the western field, and the combine harvester ran with a smoothness he had never experienced before, even when he was young. The machine seemed to accept its function, cooperating with the soil instead of trying to dominate it. The engine purred, and the shaft, now reinforced and repaired, turned effortlessly. The news spread through the farm faster than any radio. The accident stopped. Peace had returned. The workers who had fled began to return one by one. They came with their heads down, not asking for jobs, but asking if Sterling would accept them back. They didn't want bonuses or double wages. They wanted the security of working in a land that was no longer angry. Sterling welcomed them all, but with a condition that shocked everyone. "You will work hard," as always. But the Campo do Riacho is sacred. No machine, not even for mowing the lawn, will enter that perimeter, and each season before planting we will hold a ceremony of recognition. Not religious, but one of respect. The new philosophy of Hawthorne Farms was governed by dread and respect for the cycle. They began to rotate crops more intelligently, leaving large tracts of land fallow, using fewer chemicals. Productivity, to the surprise of Sterling's financial advisors, did not fall drastically. In fact, the quality of the harvest improved because the soil was healthier, happier. Sheriff Jack Donovan, who had witnessed the frantic search for the bronze disc, had to close the accident reports. He couldn't write historical curse solved by a healer, so he filed all the cases as structural metal failures under extreme and simultaneous stress. But he knew the truth, and he began to stop by the granite memorial from time to time, just to stand in silence. Sterling, for his part, changed his business focus. The money kept coming in, but he no longer saw it as a scoreboard. He began spending fortunes to uncover the true story of the massacred family. He hired historians and genealogists, not to prove Ilara's history, but to give names to the dead. He needed the memorial to be more than a symbol. It needed to be a dignified tomb. The research was difficult. Records from that time, at the beginning of the colonization of Harmony Creek, were fragmented and often written by people who had an interest in erasing the history of the cursed. But Sterling was stubborn. He used his money and influence to unearth old parish documents and minutes from community meetings. Finally, after nearly a year of relentless searching, he found a record, a baptismal record, and later, a record of a forced land sale. The family was known only by their surname, the O'Connells. The father's name was Thomas O'Connell, the mother's, Mary. And there were 3 children, whose names he managed to piece together incompletely: Liam, Sarah, and the unnamed baby. O'Connell, an Irish name suggesting settlers who came to the new land with hope, only to find the same ignorance and fear they had left behind. Sterling felt a new wave of remorse. He had desecrated not a swamp, but the resting place of Thomas, Mary, and their children. With the names in hand, Sterling commissioned a simple bronze plaque to be affixed to the granite memorial. He did not include dates or details of death, just Thomas, Mary, Liam, Sarah, and their lost son O'Connell. Here they rest honored. May the earth protect them. When the plaque was installed, Sterling held a small ceremony with only Jed and Sheriff Donovan present. It was a moment of solemn silence. "Now they have a name," said Sterling, touching the cold bronze. "Now the memory will not be lost." Sterling Hawthorne's reparations didn't stop at the farm. He became obsessed with ensuring that the Harmony Creek community understood the importance of what he had learned. He used his money to renovate the town's small library, creating a wing dedicated to the untold history of Harmony Creek. He encouraged local historians to research the legends, the whispers, and to record everything, even what seemed like superstition. He understood that his skepticism had been a form of arrogance, a refusal to accept that there was knowledge outside of his own books. The community, which initially viewed him with suspicion, the millionaire who suddenly became a mystic, began to see him with a new kind of respect. He wasn't just donating money, he was donating truth. Perhaps the most visible change was Sterling's relationship with the land itself. He stopped using helicopters to get around the farm and began walking, often alone in the late afternoon. He touched the corn, smelled the earth, and listened to the silence. On one of these walks, he found himself in Campo do Riacho, gazing at the memorial. It was late autumn, and the field, which had once been a soybean monoculture, was covered in native grass that swayed gently in the wind. He noticed something he had never seen before. On the east side of the memorial, growing wild, was a small shrub, and despite the late autumn chill, it was laden with vibrant red berries. They weren't cultivated fruits, they were wild berries which don't usually grow in that region. Sterling approached, curious. The berries were perfect, and the bush seemed to bloom with an energy that defied the season. He remembered Ilara's words. The object of power was buried to protect the harvest, to ensure abundance. He understood. The bronze disc, the guardian, was doing its job. No longer for him, Sterling, but for the land itself. The land was fertile and secure, and it was demonstrating this through a life that persisted and thrived against all odds. He touched one of the berries and felt a gentle warmth. He didn't pick them. He left them there, like a silent offering. Life on the farm settled into a new rhythm. Fear had been replaced by respectful vigilance. Jed Miller, who was now Sterling's right-hand man in every sense, not just in business but in philosophy, was primarily responsible for ensuring that the memorial was maintained and that the rules of respect were followed. Once, a new tractor operator, a young and impetuous lad, tried to cut through the corner of the creek field just a few meters from the memorial. Jed saw him from afar. Jed ran and stopped the tractor, not shouting in anger, but with a chilling seriousness. "Get off the machine, kid." The operator, startled, went downstairs. "What's the problem, Jed? I'm just saving time." "You don't waste time here," Jed said, pointing to the memorial. "You respect time. You respect what's beneath you." Jed made the young man walk to the memorial and read the bronze plaque. "You are stepping on the grave of a family that was massacred, and the earth remembers. If you disrespect this place, I will not be the one to punish you." The young man, who had heard the whispered stories of the farm, turned white. He never went near that field again. Sterling Hawthorne, now in his 60s, began planning his legacy in a way that went beyond money. He had no children, and the idea of passing the farm on to a distant nephew who only cared about profits frightened him. He decided to create a foundation, the Hawthorne Foundation for the Memory of the Earth. The goal was simple: to ensure that after his death, the creek field remained untouched and that the farm was managed by people who understood that respect for the land was the first rule. Jed Miller would be the foundation's first trustee. He met with his lawyers in Chicago, who were perplexed. They were used to complex succession plans to avoid taxes, not plans to protect a granite memorial based on a story of land revenge. "Mr. Hawthorne, this is unusual. You are restricting the use of a valuable area of land forever." "It's the most valuable area I own," Sterling replied, "because it's the only area that has taught me what real value is." He signed the documents, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't just securing the peace of his farm, he was securing the peace of Thomas and Mary O'Connell. Time passed in Harmony Creek. The story of Sterling Hawthorne became a local legend told on winter nights. It was no longer the story of the millionaire who broke machines, but the story of the man who bent down to earth and found redemption. One day, about 5 years after Ilara's arrival, Sterling received a letter. It wasn't an email or business correspondence. It was a plain envelope with no clear return address, bearing a Blackwood postage stamp. Sterling recognized the writing style, simple and firm. It was Ilara Vance's. He opened the letter with trembling hands. The handwriting was small and elegant. "Sterling Hawthorne, the silence of Harmony Creek is profound and good. The guardian is safe. You did what was right. The memory rests in peace, and the earth is grateful. I'm writing not to ask you for anything, but to give you one last piece of the story. Do you remember the second object, the engraved bone, the key to the story? You asked why the O'Connell family was buried with a protective disc. They weren't witches, they were guardians. And the disc was buried there not to protect the neighbors' crops, but to protect the soil. Thomas O'Connell knew that land was special. He knew the balance was fragile. He buried the disc as a gift to the land, not to himself. It was a payment for the life it gave them. When you took it, you not only desecrated a grave, you stole a gift. Now that he has returned, the earth accepts his gift, the memorial, as a new payment. You're no longer a farmer, Sterling. You're the new guardian. Live in peace, Ilara Vance. Sterling read the letter 3 times. He had not only stolen a family's peace of mind, he had stolen the generosity of a man who was trying to protect the land for future generations. The weight of his responsibility was even greater, but now it was a weight he carried with honor. He kept the letter in a safe next to the Foundation's documents. It was his last lesson. Sterling never saw Ilara Vance again. She remained a legendary figure, a force that came from the countryside and returned to the countryside, but her legacy lived on in every acre of Hawthorne Farms. That year, the corn harvest was the best the farm had had in decades. The weather had been perfect, the soil healthy, and the workers loyal. But Sterling didn't boast about the numbers. He looked at the creek field, at the granite memorial, and at the small bush of wild berries that stubbornly bloomed in the cold. He knew that the true success of the harvest lay not in the volume of grain, but in the peace he had achieved. He had traded greed for dignity, and the land had responded with abundance. The skeptical millionaire had become the guardian of silenced stories, and that, my friends, was the most valuable harvest of all. He had found balance. The next step in Sterling Hawthorne's life was no longer about expansion, but about preservation. He had to ensure that even after his departure, the legacy of Ilara and the O'Connells would be honored. He had to build a future that would not repeat the mistakes of the past. The man who once laughed at superstitions now lived by them, or rather, lived by the profound respect they demanded. And that was the final story of how fear and ruin were transformed into prosperity and peace in Harmony Creek. But Sterling's story didn't end with peace. It ended with the lesson he would leave for the world. He had to tell the complete story in detail of how the fury of the soil was unleashed so that no one else would make the same mistake. And he knew exactly how he would do it. He would write a book that didn't talk about modern agriculture, but about how to listen to what has no voice. The story of Sterling Hawthorne, the man who became the guardian, was only beginning to be told to the world. He had to ensure that the memory would live on forever. Sterling Hawthorne returned to Harmony Creek with his head full of stories that he, the man of numbers, never imagined he would tell. The luxury van seemed strange and empty without Ilara Vance beside him, but the silence that had once been one of fear was now one of respect. He had bought an empire, but inherited a responsibility. The first thing Sterling did, as soon as he arrived at the farm, was to go to the creek field. He didn't go to inspect, but to stand silently near the granite memorial. The small mound of dark stones, sealing the bronze disc and the memory of a family, was the center of his universe now. Peace was not an explosive event, it was a slow and steady relief, like water flowing clean again after a flood. The next morning, Jed Miller, now general supervisor, arrived early. He didn't go straight to Sterling's office, but stopped at the memorial. Sterling found him there, dusting the stones. "Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne," said Jed, without taking his eyes off the granite. "Good morning, Jed. What do we have for today?" "The new combine harvester, the one Jedediah Miller broke." Jed smiled, a sad smile. "The mechanic said it's ready. We're going to test it in the west field." Sterling felt a chill. The combine harvester was the symbol of the beginning of misfortune. "Do it, and Jed, if you feel anything strange, any jolt, stop the machine immediately." Jed shook his head. "I won't feel a thing, Mr. Hawthorne. The earth isn't pulling anymore." And Jed was right. He spent the entire day in the western field, and the combine harvester ran with a smoothness he had never experienced before, even when he was young. The machine seemed to accept its function, cooperating with the soil instead of trying to dominate it. The engine purred, and the shaft, now reinforced and repaired, turned effortlessly. The news spread through the farm faster than any radio. The accident stopped. Peace had returned. The workers who had fled began to return, one by one. They came with their heads down, not asking for jobs, but asking if Sterling would accept them back. They didn't want bonuses or double wages. They wanted the security of working in a land that was no longer angry. Sterling welcomed them all, but with a condition that shocked everyone. "You will work hard as always, but the Campo do Riacho is sacred. No machine, not even for mowing the lawn, will enter that perimeter. And each season, before planting, we will hold a ceremony of recognition. Not religious, but one of respect." The new philosophy of Hawthorne Farms was governed by Jed and respect for the cycle. They began to rotate crops more intelligently, leaving large tracts of land fallow, using fewer chemicals. Productivity, to the surprise of Sterling's financial advisors, did not fall drastically. In fact, the quality of the harvest improved because the soil was healthier, happier. Sheriff Jack Donovan, who had witnessed the frantic search for the bronze disc, had to close the accident reports. He couldn't write historical curse solved by a healer, so he filed all the cases as structural metal failures under extreme and simultaneous stress. But he knew the truth, and he began to stop by the granite memorial from time to time, just to stand in silence. Sterling, for his part, changed his business focus. The money kept coming in, but he no longer saw it as a scoreboard. He began spending fortunes to uncover the true story of the massacred family. He hired historians and genealogists, not to prove Ilara's history, but to give names to the dead. He needed the memorial to be more than a symbol. It needed to be a dignified tomb. The research was difficult. Records from that time, at the beginning of the colonization of Harmony Creek, were fragmented and often written by people who had an interest in erasing the history of the cursed. But Sterling was stubborn. He used his money and influence to unearth old parish documents and minutes from community meetings. Finally, after nearly a year of relentless searching, he found a record, a baptismal record, and later, a record of a forced land sale. The family was known only by their surname, the O'Connells. The father's name was Thomas O'Connell, the mother's, Mary. And there were 3 children, whose names he managed to piece together incompletely: Liam, Sarah, and the unnamed baby. O'Connell, an Irish name suggesting settlers who came to the new land with hope, only to find the same ignorance and fear they had left behind. Sterling felt a new wave of remorse. He had desecrated not a swamp, but the resting place of Thomas, Mary, and their children. With the names in hand, Sterling commissioned a simple bronze plaque to be affixed to the granite memorial. He did not include dates or details of death, just Thomas, Mary, Liam, Sarah, and their lost son O'Connell. Here they rest honored. May the earth protect them. When the plaque was installed, Sterling held a small ceremony with only Jed and Sheriff Donovan present. It was a moment of solemn silence. "Now they have a name," said Sterling, touching the cold bronze. "Now the memory will not be lost." Sterling Hawthorne's reparations didn't stop at the farm. He became obsessed with ensuring that the Harmony Creek community understood the importance of what he had learned. He used his money to renovate the town's small library, creating a wing dedicated to the untold history of Harmony Creek. He encouraged local historians to research the legends, the whispers, and to record everything, even what seemed like superstition. He understood that his skepticism had been a form of arrogance, a refusal to accept that there was knowledge outside of his own books. The community, which initially viewed him with suspicion, the millionaire who suddenly became a mystic, began to see him with a new kind of respect. He wasn't just donating money, he was donating truth. Perhaps the most visible change was Sterling's relationship with the land itself. He stopped using helicopters to get around the farm and began walking, often alone in the late afternoon. He touched the corn, smelled the earth, and listened to the silence. On one of these walks, he found himself in Campo do Riacho, gazing at the memorial. It was late autumn, and the field, which had once been a soybean monoculture, was covered in native grass that swayed gently in the wind. He noticed something he had never seen before. On the east side of the memorial, growing wild, was a small shrub, and despite the late autumn chill, it was laden with vibrant red berries. They weren't cultivated fruits, they were wild berries which don't usually grow in that region. Sterling approached, curious. The berries were perfect, and the bush seemed to bloom with an energy that defied the season. He remembered Ilara's words. The object of power was buried to protect the harvest, to ensure abundance. He understood. The bronze disc, the guardian, was doing its job. No longer for him, Sterling, but for the land itself. The land was fertile and secure, and it was demonstrating this through a life that persisted and thrived against all odds. He touched one of the berries and felt a gentle warmth. He didn't pick them. He left them there, like a silent offering. Life on the farm settled into a new rhythm. Fear had been replaced by respectful vigilance. Jed Miller, who was now Sterling's right-hand man in every sense, not just in business but in philosophy, was primarily responsible for ensuring that the memorial was maintained and that the rules of respect were followed. Once, a new tractor operator, a young and impetuous lad, tried to cut through the corner of the creek field just a few meters from the memorial. Jed saw him from afar. Jed ran and stopped the tractor, not shouting in anger, but with a chilling seriousness. "Get off the machine, kid." The operator, startled, went downstairs. "What's the problem, Jed? I'm just saving time." "You don't waste time here," Jed said, pointing to the memorial. "You respect time. You respect what's beneath you." Jed made the young man walk to the memorial and read the bronze plaque. "You are stepping on the grave of a family that was massacred, and the earth remembers. If you disrespect this place, I will not be the one to punish you." The young man, who had heard the whispered stories of the farm, turned white. He never went near that field again. Sterling Hawthorne, now in his 60s, began planning his legacy in a way that went beyond money. He had no children, and the idea of passing the farm on to a distant nephew who only cared about profits frightened him. He decided to create a foundation, the Hawthorne Foundation for the Memory of the Earth. The goal was simple: to ensure that after his death, the creek field remained untouched and that the farm was managed by people who understood that respect for the land was the first rule. Jed Miller would be the foundation's first trustee. He met with his lawyers in Chicago, who were perplexed. They were used to complex succession plans to avoid taxes, not plans to protect a granite memorial based on a story of land revenge. "Mr. Hawthorne, this is unusual. You are restricting the use of a valuable area of land forever." "It's the most valuable area I own," Sterling replied, "because it's the only area that has taught me what real value is." He signed the documents, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't just securing the peace of his farm, he was securing the peace of Thomas and Mary O'Connell. Time passed in Harmony Creek. The story of Sterling Hawthorne became a local legend told on winter nights. It was no longer the story of the millionaire who broke machines, but the story of the man who bent down to earth and found redemption. One day, about 5 years after Ilara's arrival, Sterling received the letter. He kept it in a safe next to the foundation's documents. It was his last lesson. Sterling never saw Ilara Vance again. She remained a legendary figure, a force that came from the countryside and returned to the countryside. But her legacy lived on in every acre of Hawthorne Farms. That year, the corn harvest was the best the farm had had in decades. The weather had been perfect, the soil healthy, and the workers loyal. But Sterling didn't boast about the numbers. He looked at the creek field, at the granite memorial, and at the small bush of wild berries that stubbornly bloomed in the cold. He knew that the true success of the harvest lay not in the volume of grain, but in the peace he had achieved. He had traded greed for dignity, and the land had responded with abundance. The skeptical millionaire had become the guardian of silenced stories, and that, my friends, was the most valuable harvest of all. He had found balance. Sterling, fulfilling a promise he had made to himself, began to write. He did not write a financial memoir, but a testimony. The book, titled The Guardian of the Soil, the story of the man who had to listen to the earth, was published 2 years later. The academic and agricultural world scoffed at the book. They called it Gothic fiction and superstition disguised as confession. But the book spoke directly to the hearts of ordinary people, to farmers who felt the pressure of progress and the exhaustion of the soil. Sterling Hawthorne's book, by the richest man in the county, validated the whispers and legends that modern science tried to silence. The impact was slow but profound. Farmers from all over the country began visiting Harmony Creek, not to ask for advice on fertilizers, but to see the granite memorial and talk to Jed Miller. They wanted to understand what it meant to respect the memory of the land. Sterling never tried to convince the skeptics. He simply pointed to his thriving farm, his loyal workers, and the creek field, which remained untouched. The proof was in the silence. Sterling Hawthorne lived for another 15 years, a man who found peace late in life. He died peacefully in his mahogany house, overlooking the fields he had learned to love in a way that money could never buy. His funeral was simple, but the procession of cars that accompanied him was enormous. And they weren't just bankers and businessmen. They were farmers, rural workers, and ordinary people whom he had taught to look at the ground with reverence. He was buried on a small hill, a respectful distance from Creek Field, but facing it. In his will, he made it clear that the Hawthorne Foundation was the sole and permanent owner of the farm, ensuring that the memorial and Creek Field would never be disturbed. Jed Miller took over as president of the foundation, ensuring that Sterling's legacy and the memory of the O'Connells would continue to live on. And so, my friends, ends the story of how greed and arrogance were broken by an invisible force, and how healing came through an extraordinary act of humility, guided by a woman who knew that the deepest truth is not in engineering books, but in the roots of the earth. The inexplicable accidents ceased forever, and in Harmony Creek, Iowa, Sterling Hawthorne's lesson remained. To succeed in life, you first need peace with the ground that sustains you. And peace often requires the restoration of lost honor. The farm prospered, not because of its money, but because of its respect. And that, my friends, is the most valuable harvest of all.